This is the examination of the hidden human condition.
You're listening to the Hidden Killers Podcast.
This is the Hidden Killers Podcast with Tony Brueski.
We are going to play back for you in its entirety right now my interview that I had with Dr. Katherine Ramsland the other day. We were talking about BTK. She literally wrote the book on BTK. Talked with him, interviewed him, spent several years putting that together. And for an hour, we got a chance to discuss that process. We've played it for you in pieces over the last couple of weeks here. I believe last week it aired in pieces. This is it in its entirety, the full hour with Dr. Katherine Ramsland, psychologist who wrote the book on BTK. Katherine, welcome to the program. I want to start by learning how you got involved in BTK's world and ended up penning an amazing autobiography about the notorious killer.
Well, I've been teaching a course on extreme offenders for several decades, and I had just finished a book where I looked at a dozen cases of mental health experts who had spent a lot of time with either a mass or serial killer trying to learn as much detail about their developmental process as possible. And just as I finished that book, I had seen a woman on Facebook who claimed had claimed 5 years earlier she was writing a book on BTK. And I asked her whatever happened to that. And she begged me to take it over. So I had just finished a book about doing exactly that. And how could I turn it down? It was a great opportunity. It took some time because I had to be evaluated by the victims' families because he had signed over his life rights to them and they would get a large percentage of whatever the book made, which was fine. I had to write a proposal that everybody agreed with. And essentially it was to be able to use whatever Rader tells me to benefit law enforcement, criminology, and forensic psychology. So that was a long process. And getting him on board after he'd been working with the other woman, that took a little time as well. But, a couple months, we played a chess game. And then finally, it was all in place to go ahead and work on this. The whole process from the time I began talking with her until I finished the first draft was 5 years, which I've written a lot of books and I've never spent that much time.
Sure.
on a book.
Sure. Lots of time.
I'm sorry.
I just said, sure. Lots of time.
Yeah, it's a lot of time, but it wasn't an opportunity. I went to the prison to meet him. We talked a lot on the phone. He wrote very long and detailed letters. He had police reports that he had put his own notes on. So that was interesting. He did drawings, he wrote poetry. So he was a multi-layered person. The experience of exploring this with him, I think, was, really unique. Except the last time I did it, but it's certainly probably the most in-depth that I've done and taught me things, taught him things. I think it did make a contribution. Certainly, I've heard that. Some people, I use it as a textbook in my classes. Other people have said the same.
Sure. When you were in that process of gaining trust, you had two groups to gain the trust of, the victims' families as well as Dennis. Can you talk about how you went about that in greater detail? I know there was a lot of back and forth and such, but what did you do to gain that trust and show people, hey, look, this is straightforward. I'm here to learn from this, and hopefully others can learn from what I'm trying to research here as well.
Well, with the victims' families, and they were the first, they and their attorney, it was a matter of showing them that I am taking a clinical interest in this, not a tabloid type of interest. I didn't really want to glorify anything or do really graphic stuff.
Sure.
But it was going to be from his point of view. So they had... And there would be a book one way or another. So this is the way they could at least control a bit what was going on with that. And they appreciated my credentials. There had been people who had approached them who did want to do more of a tabloid kind of thing, and they just turned them down.
Sure.
So I think when I told them my intent and agreed to the terms, and that this was really for me a professional research project, and that's what I wanted to use it for, they were on board. It didn't take that long. I think the first person I talked to was Charlie Otero, who had discovered his parents murdered. They were the first of the victims. And then, he brought some of the others on board. Then I met the attorney, and he approved me. So that's how it went with them. But with Dennis, he had been working with this other woman. He really liked her. He didn't realize she wanted to get out of it, that it was overwhelming. She'd actually been using one of my books as a model because she hadn't written a book before, and that it's a daunting process. So I think she's the one who really persuaded him to transfer what he was doing with her to me. And the fact that the first thing he wanted me to do was solve some codes.
Yeah.
Because he wanted to see if I'd play the game. That was the thing with him. He had all these codes, and would I do it? If I had said, no, I won't, then I'm done. I'm not going to be part of that.
Sure.
But I did, because it was interesting that this is what he wanted to do, how we solved. It was kind of a big puzzle that involved the other author. And so we figured out what his codes meant. And then in the end, I ended up writing the code that we used for the book. So that was kind of a weird turnaround, but it still played into that perspective for him, that he had this kind of spy thing going on, and he wanted to know when I, do it. And I did. And I also played games of chess with him by mail. I'm the kind of, I used to be a therapist also.
Yeah.
So I'm the kind of researcher who wants the world of that person to unfold in front of me, rather than me imposing what I think onto whatever they have to say. So I wanted to, whatever it was he was going to do, I wanted to take it all in. But at the same time, I'm learning about him through other channels. I knew the DA pretty well. I saw all the stuff she had on him. I had the interrogation files, the entire interrogation that they had with him. I read other people, letters he'd written to other people. So I had a number of perspectives on him that helped me to get, a sense of when he might be lying or exaggerating or manipulating. Mm-hmm. Certainly, I wasn't 100% accurate, because people like him are pretty clever, but I think it turned out well, and I still talk to him 13 years later.
Interesting. Were you surprised by the codes, by the challenge that he put up right away? Is that something that you were expecting or not expecting in Dennis at that time?
Well, I kind of was expecting it, because the person he had worked with before kind of prepared me for, that I'll have a code name. She has a code name.
Sure.
Anyone he talks to. So there's this filter you have to go through, and it was fine. Didn't really surprise me. It was just like, it's different.
Yeah.
And I wanted to see what that was about.
How did you go into the conversation? Obviously, there's a lot of information, a lot of different areas to explore with someone like him. Where did you begin to kind of take that journey of hearing things from his own mind, from his own perspective?
Well, I believe he has hypergraphia, which is a excessive rating.
Okay.
So that was a good thing and a bad thing, because it was a good thing because he would fill pages and pages of details, up the page, down the page, every which way. But at the same time, he didn't have very good handwriting. So it was time consuming, but just the fact that I would have these written documents was good, because then I could use those as springboards for questions back to him. Seeing him, in the prison, I couldn't be in the same room with him because he's in a maximum security prison. So it was through monitors and stuff, but just that I would come mattered to him. And we probably talked more on the phone than really any other medium, because first of all, it was easier to do. It put him at ease to be able to just talk about TV shows we were watching. And those shows actually became metaphors for being able to communicate, because we watched things like The Walking Dead and Bates Motel and The Americans, Breaking Bad. So these are all really great for talking about his stuff, but through this kind of coded medium that he wanted, so that the guards wouldn't understand what we were trying to talk about. And I don't know, it fell into sort of a natural rhythm. It wasn't really hard to talk to him. He's very easy. He was respectful, which I can't say for other serial killers.
Sure.
I mean, I've talked to others who have been respectful, but I also know about some who violate. If you set parameters, don't call me after 9, they'll call you at midnight.
Yeah.
They'll demand money. They'll maybe be vulgar. They'll ask for things. So Rader was not like that. He was respectful. He appreciated what I was trying to do. He read some difficult things. I sent a couple of books that I wanted him to read and think about and comment on regarding his own case. And he made his way through them. So he worked hard at it. And I just think I was probably fortunate to work with someone who is willing to. Certainly he's a spin doctor,
sure,
like many psychopathic types of people are. He wanted me to think certain things of him, and I know I didn't see everything. He might show somebody else, for example, but I heard enough about him through other people to get, I think, a pretty full picture of who he was.
What were some of the writings that you sent him that he had some difficulty working through, but ultimately did? How did those things affect him, and how did those conversations go?
Probably the first, maybe the hardest one, and so they didn't all get through, by the way. The
Sure.
prison did stop some, even though they were academic books. He read Adrian Raine's, I think it was The Anatomy of Violence. I think that's the name of it.
Okay.
Adrian Raine is one of the predominant forensic psychologists researching violence, and in particular through brain scans. So that book was about a lot of the neuropsychology and neuropsychiatry that's been done over the past couple of decades. And Raine was one of the earliest people to actually study this, and studied violent kinds of factors in childhood. So I wanted Rader to read some of this. And one of the things that really struck him, Adrian Raine talks a lot about a serial killer named Randy Kraft. And Randy Kraft and Dennis Rader have a lot of things in common. So, Rader's narcissistic. So anything that he reads that's going to stand out to him as something he wants to talk about is going to be about him in some way. So he would skip things that were like, who cares? But those things that really struck him as relevant to his own situation, then he would read that. But it took him probably 2 years to read that book. But he made his way through it. I think I sent him a few magazine articles or academic articles. It was hard to get books through. That was harder. Yeah. But if I didn't get the books through, I could talk to him about some of it. And he actually watched the entire series on the brain that was on PBS at the time. And interesting, because one was on the violent brain. And so he wanted to discuss the implications for him. Might he have had brain damage? Because he was dropped on his head. He had a head injury when he was a teenager. So he wished he could get like some kind of MRI scan, something like that. But, he just tried to find his way through these things. I gave him a few psychiatric assessment tests, like fantasy prone personality was one, because I thought he was one, and turned out he came up with a very high score. So, you can't rely on self-assessment.
Sure.
When you're trying to do this with somebody who's incarcerated and you're not in a testing room, you have to kind of give it to them and see what they do with it. So it's not really particularly accurate or something you would put into a database, but it's still what was a good foundation for being able to ask him questions.
Is Dennis curious about why he is the way he is himself, the way that he so nonchalantly delivered the statement in his sentencing hearing about everything that happened and the way that we've heard him speak in the past, very matter of fact, without a lot of emotion. Does he wonder about why he's that way?
You have to remember the context of that.
Yeah.
What you saw recorded when he was at that hearing, he was completely blindsided. He thought he was just going in to plead guilty and go back to jail.
Okay.
It turned out the judge wanted to walk him through everything. And so he's okay.
Yeah.
I'll answer these, but that was not representative of the way he speaks to me.
Okay, interesting.
Which is not to say that he's sorry, because I'm not going to say that.
Sure.
But certainly that court appearance is not reflective of who he is. Now, he is interested in knowing why he turned out to be this way, especially because a lot was at stake. He lost his family. He lost his social standing. He lost, a lot of stuff. And he was 59 when he was arrested. So he had a pretty full life up to that point.
Sure.
And everything was completely, significantly changed. So yeah, he's very interested in knowing if there's a way for him to understand that. Does he experience remorse? I would say not very deeply, especially not about the victims or their families. Although when we did a 4-part A&E documentary on the book, and it made him cry when he watched the other people talking on it. So that's interesting.
Interesting.
That surprised me.
Yeah, because my question would be, he doesn't show remorse. Is he an individual you believe that is capable of showing remorse? Because I believe some people they're not. It's not an emotion that they're able to feel or generate. But then we do see, like you just said, if he shed tears after that documentary, that's an interesting fact.
Yeah, and some people would say, well, he's just crying for himself. Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not inside his head. I can't say that he has how deep his feelings go. I can't say that about anybody I know, frankly. So the points at which he became emotional were points at which people were talking about the horrible impact on their life of losing their loved ones. So is that remorse? Maybe. Is he regretful? Absolutely. Does he have remorse about hurting his family? Yes, he does.
How interesting. And it makes you wonder, is he relating to those moments when people are talking about that because of his own loss of his own family? Is it reminding him of that? Or is he feeling it for what happened to the other people? That's kind of the question. Is it more of a narcissistic, I'm feeling this and because I'm thinking about my own situation, not necessarily what I did to others?
It's not possible to know that, in part because, some of the brain work, the brain scans that we are doing show differences in, first of all, the psychopathic brain. Secondly, the violent brain. So put violence and psychopathy together. In fact, most psychopaths are not violent or criminals. Mm-hmm. Those that are, Rader might qualify, in which case it does look as if their emotionality is fairly superficial. They know the words, not the music. As Robert Hare would say, he's the person who made the psychopathy checklist, which is a diagnostic instrument. So that's the sense of it. But you know what? I'm not in their head. I don't know how deep it goes. And I don't think anybody knows.
When you talk to him about the various crimes that he committed, the various cases, how did he handle himself? Was it anyway how we saw, very matter of fact? I know you said it felt different in that hearing. Was he trying to justify his actions? Walk me there. How were those conversations about the specific lives that he took and his ways of going about doing so? Well,
he took 10 lives that we know of. He had a far longer list of people he targeted. He sent me a list of 55 projects, as he called them.
Yeah.
These were people who didn't come home when he expected them to. There he is sitting in their house waiting to kill them. They didn't get there, or, something else interrupted the plan. So he certainly knew what he was doing. He didn't justify it. He just, as a teenager, he identified himself with serial killers. He read about Harvey Glattman from the 1950s. He read about H.H. Holmes. He wanted to be famous like them. He wanted to be on the cover of these True Detective magazines. He wanted to make women captive and helpless like they did. So he was excited about that from a fairly young age. Before the word serial killer was even being used, he was already identifying himself in that manner. And that became part of his fantasy life for years. It carried him through his military service, brought him back home. He got married before he acted out at all. So he didn't justify anything. He just knew that he had to have a double life. He was going to go ahead and be a citizen, father, a husband, and involved in his church, but he was also going to let himself be the serial killer that he wanted to be. So to him, that was just who he was. It wasn't really a matter of justifying it in any way.
How did he go about, to start something like that after you've married, after you've gone through military service? You got some life, behind you a little bit. And then to suddenly start acting that out, it seems bizarre. How did he explain that?
Well, first he tried to abduct a young woman, and that didn't work out so well. She got away. So that was kind of the first acting. But he had a very active, rich, multidimensional fantasy life. He envisioned himself doing these things. He had a hit kit. He had a ruse. He had, ideas about what he was going to do. So mental rehearsal, years of it, prepared him to do it. Then he lost a job that mattered very much to him. And his wife suddenly became the breadwinner, which, in 1974 in the Midwest, it's a good place for a man to be.
Sure.
And he was frustrated and angry, and he broke into someone's house, and he felt powerful doing it. The person wasn't home, but he felt powerful doing it. And it wasn't long after that he saw Julie and Josephine Otero. He had a mother-daughter fantasy. He thought it would be pretty easy to get into their house, abduct them, and take them to an abandoned barn. This is the fantasy.
Yeah.
And take them to an abandoned barn and do what he wanted to them. But what he didn't count on was that Joseph Otero, the father, was home that day. They also had a guard dog, and Joey Otero was home that day. So he walked into a house with 4 people. And this is his first experience of having to do something that is going to end up with everybody dead in the house. He was quite daunted by it, but he put it in motion. He had to go through with it. They'd seen him. He just decided to go through with it. None of the plan worked. First of all, their car was out of gas, so he wasn't going to be able to take that anywhere. And so he just ended up binding all of them in different rooms and strangling them. And even that, as he talks about it, was very difficult because strangling somebody took a long time and his hands got tired. And he didn't think he was going to be able to manage it. And actually, the girl, 11-year-old girl, Josephine, revived. And so he took her into the basement and hanged her from a pipe. So it was a horrible experience, but none of it was well planned, despite the fact that he thought he was planning it well.
Yeah.
A lot of mistakes made. He left some things behind he had to go back and get. It was the middle of the day. He could have so easily been caught. So he's very surprised that he wasn't.
That's what I was going to ask. Was he surprised that he wasn't caught immediately after that? Was there a time of fear of just waiting for those officers to show up at the doorstep after that?
Yes, he believed somebody had seen him. He was sure he'd left something that incriminated him. He'd parked his car not very far away, and he really expected that. He kept a few items, but he hid them. He had these, what he called hidey holes around the house, and he had Joseph Otero's watch, and he had, I think, a radio, a couple other things that he'd taken from the house. And so he hid them, but he was scared. He really thought he was going to get caught.
He obviously continued on with more crimes. How did he gain the confidence to continue? Was it the fact that time had passed and he had not been caught, and that just kind of slowly built the confidence crime by crime?
Yeah, I'm not sure it was confidence as much as compulsion.
Okay.
He didn't get caught, so that felt better, but he killed only 3 months later. It wasn't a very long time to pass. He didn't get caught. Nothing in the news suggested he had been seen, that they had a suspect or anything like that. And so then he thought, if he's more careful about the next person he's going to choose, then he minimizes his chances of being caught again. And so he scoped out a house where there was a young woman who lived alone and no dogs. So he, and he watched her routines, so he figured out when she'd be there, when she wouldn't. And so he's a lot more careful with the second incident. But he did break into the house. He did wait for her, but she came home with her brother. So once again, he's made a pretty huge mistake.
Yeah.
And he put them in 2 different rooms, tied her up, but he struggled with the brother. The brother went to grab, he had 2 guns with them. The brother went to grab, Kevin was the brother. He went to grab one of the guns, and Rader really thought he was going to get shot and killed in this particular house. He did shoot Kevin and shot him in the head, but Kevin nevertheless, and thought he was dead, went back to the other room and heard Kevin run out. Kevin was able to get up and run out, even though he was shot. And so now Rader is realizing, oh my God, now we have a witness and I have very little time, but still he stayed.
Yeah.
And he didn't shoot her. He stabbed her because he had read about it in a magazine, that this is how some other killer had done it. And so it was an experiment. And he didn't like it. He didn't like stabbing somebody. It was horrible from his perspective. She was still alive when the police came.
Yeah.
But he had a plan. I think this is where he had a bag of groceries that he had stashed somewhere, and he could pick it up and look like he was just in the neighborhood shopping.
Yeah.
If somebody were to stop him and ask, he would look like just an innocent resident getting something from the grocery store.
In Wichita, I spent about 10 years there working at a radio station called KFDI, the big news radio station. Was there right after he was sentenced. And what I learned when living in Wichita is almost everyone has some sort of a connective BTK story, whether it's themselves, their aunt, their mom, their sister, their brother. There's always somebody who has some degree of separation from what they suspect may have been an interaction with Dennis Rader. Many stories of, well, I came home and the back door was open and it was at the time of when he was striking and nothing happened. But a lot of people wonder, were they could have been a victim? I know he had that longer list. Did he talk about going out and scaring people or doing missions of just trying to see what the situation would be like, going into people's homes, not with the intention to kill that day, but to basically do reconnaissance on a home?
Oh, he did do that. Now, I'll just say this. I get a lot of emails from people who are sure he tried to pick them up or he came in their house, and they described things that didn't happen, at least he wasn't in that neighborhood, or he wasn't there that day, or that was not his MO.
Sure.
So I do get, because everybody wants to think that was the only person who was out there doing this. And he wasn't by any means the only person doing these kinds of things. But yes, he would go into houses to check them out. He was actually a security system person. He would go into people's homes and install their security systems. Mm-hmm. So he did know layouts. He did know how security systems worked. If he identified a potential victim doing that, he would know how to set it up so he could let himself in. So he did do a few where he then did not go back, but certainly had ideas about possibilities.
How did he talk about how he managed to balance home and murder life, if you will, home and work life?
He has a great metaphor, actually.
Yeah.
Psychologists call this compartmentalization, which is a long word, that isn't really as vivid as Rader's idea. He calls it cubing.
Okay.
And by that he means that take a cube, and on each side is an identity. So Boy Scout, volunteer, good husband, serial killer, thief, good father, church president, things like that. So if you think of each of the sides of the cube as being one of those identities, he could turn whatever side he needed, depending on the circumstances, and flip, make quick pivots to another one if needed. So he could be a good neighbor, but then he spots one of his neighbors, which didn't happen, that he thought would make a good victim, and bang, and turn it back around. He's the serial killer now. But turn that back around, he's the good father when his daughter gets scared that a woman in her neighborhood had been killed.
Yeah.
Right? So it's all the sides are one person, but they're not visible to him when he's got one side turned out. Right? So
Sure.
I think that's a really interesting notion. He called them life frames, and that he can switch in and out of any given life frame depending on the circumstances. And that would only be achievable if you do not have any commitment to integrity or truth. And someone who's a narcissist, especially a psychopathic type of narcissist, doesn't. Their commitment is to themselves and to what they want. So they will use anything they need to get there. And if what they want is to live a supposedly normal life while also being able to kill, they'll develop their life to accommodate both.
Sure. Was there ever any time that he spoke of prior to his arrest for those many decades that he was concerned that maybe a family member may have been on to him or suspicious in any way, shape, or form of his activities?
He was afraid a couple of times that his wife, like once he was writing a postcard because he played this cat and mouse game with the media where he'd send things.
Sure.
And once his wife caught him spelling something, she said, "You spell your words like that BTK guy."
Oh.
And he quickly covered and said, "Well, we probably went to the same schools with the same kinds of exercises and whatnot."
Yeah.
There were a couple other things where, but the thing is, let me just say on her behalf, and on behalf of all families of these guys everywhere, no one is thinking the guy I live with is a serial killer,
Sure.
or my son or my daughter. They're not thinking that. They will see almost everything in the most benign possible way. So it's easy to say, well, okay, that makes sense. Or, well, you were out last night and this murder happened. Oh, okay, you were at the library. Okay. That's typically what people will do.
Sure.
They will not immediately go, well, wait a minute, you were gone and a murder happened, so you must be the murderer. Because that would make them automatically unsafe to think that. So,
Sure.
People noticed a couple of odd things that made him sweat, but nobody really thought too much about it. And I think that's what you're going to find in one case after another of those serial killers who have families and have jobs and have obligations. Is it's very easy for people around them to not see how evil they are, how duplicitous they are, how manipulative they are, because for the most part, we're not thinking that about other people.
Did he ever actively try to condition his family in one way, shape, or form to help hide who he was? That's something I've been wondering about a bit with the recent Rex Heuermann arrest. Makes me wonder how much was going on with this family that slowly, insidiously, he got them thinking one way to hide his tracks, where otherwise they may look a little more evident.
Well, it's not just family, it's friends, it's
Sure.
a co-worker. I mean, that's what a person who's living a double life, and whether it's a serial killer or someone just having an affair.
Sure.
A person living a double life is actively deceiving people on a regular basis to keep them from being suspicious. And since Rader wasn't killing anywhere except for in one instance, he wasn't killing where his family might say, well, wow, you knew that person, or you were last seen with that person. It wasn't anything like that. So why would they think anything?
Sure. When he was playing the cat and mouse game with the media, we know that was one of his favorite things to do. I guess it's with police as well. It's a weird thing, because if you got away with it and no one's suspecting who you are, I guess those of us who aren't serial killers would think the last thing you want to do is be sending out, fishing lines to the media, fishing lines to the police that could possibly somehow lead back to you. What was it about that? Was it his desire for the notoriety of the type of books and the images and the people that he studied in childhood, like H.H. Holmes and such, that he was doing whatever he could to get the infamous BTK out there into the spotlight? Was that a big part of his MO?
It started when he heard that the police, it was about 8 months after the Otero, he heard that the police had arrested 3 men. And this bugged him because he knew that they were on the wrong track, and they were wasting taxpayer money.
Okay.
That is truly
that's
what started him on his path.
The taxpayer money issue. That's
And so he wrote a long description of the Otero murders and said, I'm the only one to do this. And he put this into an engineering book in the Wichita Library, or I think Wichita State University Library, and sent a reporter to get it.
Sure.
Whereupon that reporter turned it over to the police. And this is the first time Rader is basically saying, I did those 3 dudes you arrested, is the way he referred to it, are not the guys. I did this alone. And at this point, he's now thinking, because it ends up in the news, he's thinking, this is kind of cool. They don't know who I am, and I can be manipulative. And so he begins to crave the notoriety. And he does send a letter talking about Jack the Ripper, Ted of the West Coast, is what he called Ted Bundy, a few others he names, Son of Sam. Why are they getting this attention? I'm not. And so as he's noticing others in the news, he wonders, why isn't the Wichita killer getting it? And at this point, he names himself. He's the one who came up with BTK.
Yep.
For bind them, torture them, strangle them.
Yep.
So, and he actually had quite a few names that he suggested, like the poet strangler and things like that.
Yeah.
So BTK caught on. And then it became, I want to communicate by using this way. And then he wrote a couple of poems about some of the victims that he sent in. And then he went silent for a while. He did not communicate on his final 3 victims at all. And we called one in, not of the final 3, but of the first 7, he called one in because he wanted to see it in the newspaper, but he didn't communicate at all for the final 3. And Wichita was not sure what was going on. But then an attorney, on the, 30th anniversary, an attorney wanted to write a book about it. He was going to be writing about the 7 murders of the Wichita serial killer that very few people had heard of. Actually, we had been writing about it for Court TV. We did have a piece on it. And when Rader decided he did not want someone writing his story, that's when he came back out and started playing the cat and mouse game. And he actually plagiarized from the Court TV piece. so much for not wanting, and he says, no, he didn't. But I say, well, how did your titles end up being the same then?
Yeah.
For your chapters. So, he wanted to write his own story. So it was that. And then all of a sudden he started thinking about the readers and viewers of Wichita media being his fan club that he had to please. So he had a lot of different motivations for the communications.
How does he view society today that we're sitting here, we're talking about him right now? Does he still view this as a fan club? Does he view this as people who are trying to study and understand his way of thinking? I mean, how does he view society today now that he's behind bars? He's been caught. It's no longer a cat and mouse mystery. Where does he stand on that?
Well, he does have a fan club because lots and lots
Sure.
and lots of people write to him, send him money, want some kind of association with him. Lots of people do. So he still has that. He still enjoys seeing his name. Like with the arrest of the Long Island, the alleged Long Island serial killer, he immediately got out there and said, wait a minute, there's parallels between him and me.
Yeah.
So when he sees things that he thinks should be linked to him, he wants that notoriety. He wants to be known. He is probably one of the most famous living serial killers right now,
Sure.
I would say. And he likes that.
It has been interesting to watch, quite honestly, over the last year or so, when something big happens and there's some sort of a mass killing or a serial killer or something happen. There you have your commentary from many people, but seemingly Dennis Rader pops into the conversation almost every time with some sort of commentary. It's been interesting that I feel like he's almost found another niche of where to comment and talk about, because people will listen if he's talking about a current murder investigation.
And that's long been a notion of ours, that serial killers have special insight. I even wrote a blog about it.
Yeah.
Do they really?
Do they? Yes.
The idea that you can use one to catch another. And that was, Ted Bundy's ploy with the Green River Killer is, I can help you with that.
Yeah.
He didn't particularly. So every once in a while, they might have something to say, and not necessarily because they're serial killers, but because they do study these cases. They do think about them. I don't know that they have, some kind of privileged insight just because they've been murderers.
Sure.
But that's the idea. In fact, that happened with the Austrian serial killer, Jack Unterweger. He had committed murder, gone to prison, supposed to be life in prison, but he started writing poetry and plays and whatnot. And so the Austrian literati got him out of prison, saying art had cured him, whereupon people started dying. And the newspapers hired him to cover thinking, well, he's a murderer. He's a good person and a writer. He's a good person to cover these incidents. Well, he's also the guy doing them.
Covering his own murders. Yeah.
Yes.
With Dennis, there's obviously been people who've said their accusations made that maybe he's behind this murder, that murder, some other unsolved cases in various areas. Do you believe there are more victims out there that he has not admitted to yet? Or are you fairly confident that he would have said by now and would have admitted to anything that he's done at this point?
I would never say it's a complete deal. But that being said, I know that the ones that he is currently being questioned about, there's no evidence linking him to them at all. So I wouldn't say there aren't anymore, because what we have found, sometimes the serial killers won't talk about their very earliest murder because it was such a mess. They don't want to own up to it, or it was a child, or, there's something about it they don't want to admit to, or different race, different, whatever. So I would never say that's it. He's telling us the full truth. But that doesn't mean I think the cases currently under investigation will be successfully resolved with him with him indicted. I don't think so.
When you look back at all the work you put into this, what are some of the key takeaways that you walk away going, I learned this from this interaction, from this time period, from all of this research? What are some of those things that you feel you really gained from all of that?
Well, I think the biggest contribution my book makes is that we don't have the formula. There used to be this notion that, which came largely from the FBI, is that we have this idea of who serial killers are and how they were made.
Sure.
And Dennis is an outlier. He doesn't fit that formula. And he shows us to stop doing that, because what happens is it builds expectations in investigators. And one of them, who could have caught Rader, decided, well, a Boy Scout volunteer is not going to be a serial killer. So he did not, when he stopped him, or he encountered him in a rest stop, he was supposed to search the car. That was his job. Didn't, because Rader persuaded him, I'm just up here at the Boy Scout camp. So we need to learn that our formulas are strictly trying to make us feel safe, and they're not necessarily true. And I think Rader's case shows us that.
It's easier for us to tell ourselves stories to make ourselves feel safer than deal with reality.
I think it's not just easier. I think it's ingrained in us. It's a way to feel safe because we want to feel safe. It's the path of least resistance is to find ways to believe we've mastered the information and that we'll be okay.
Sure.
And yet, case after case, you're finding not necessarily.
What's Dennis' goals for the rest of his life? I know you said earlier that you still speak with him from time to time. In his current state of existence, where he's been commenting on true crime lately, where does he want to go? What does he want to do with his time that he has left?
Well, he's 78. He's not in great health. He knows that. There's not a lot to even think about being able to do with his life. So
Sure.
I don't think he has aspirations like, oh, I want to be a commentator or something like that.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, if he wants to use, anything to try and do good with the bad that is
I think
within
he
him.
thinks the book is the way to have done good.
Okay.
That he participated in the book, and the book is making a contribution to the fields of study where we are trying to figure out criminogenic factors and early interventions. So I think he thinks that's exactly what he did with the book.
Does he want to make a contribution in terms of through the book to prevent others like him from going down the path that he went down?
He does. He thinks he wishes somebody could have intervened with him. Yeah, I think that is ideal, but it's not a fervent hope. It's not like I would love for my life to be turned around and totally redeemed is not in his mind.
This is an examination of the hidden human condition
This is the Hidden Killers Podcast
with Tony Brueski.